will. Tim Marx began his duties as CEO of Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, the largest comprehensive social service nonprofit in the Twin Cities region, and probably broader than that by now, on April Fool's Day, 2011. But he's no fool. Before coming to Catholic Charities, Tim served as executive director of the New York City-based Common Ground. Prior to that, he worked as Minnesota Housing Commissioner, St. Paul City Attorney, Deputy Mayor, and as a lawyer in private practice. The big exciting thing that's going on these days at Catholic Charities is under his leadership, they're building a $100 million new Dorothy Day Center in downtown St. Paul. And you were telling me, what's the anniversary?
The first phase opened.
No, the anniversary of Dorothy Day.
Oh, Dorothy Day. Her birthday was last week, I want to say Tuesday, and she would have been 120.
120.
Oh.
Well, there are two phases to this project. The first is Dorothy Day Place, which opened across the street from the old shelter last January and already houses nearly 500 people in a range of accommodations, including emergency shelter beds, pay-for-stay, interim housing, and permanent apartments. Phase 2 being built on the old shelter site, which won't be complete until June of 2019, so you can tell from that the size of this project, will include 177 apartments, a health clinic, mental health services, a career center, and a veterans resource hub. Services will be provided by a variety of partner organizations, including Ramsey County, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and healthcare providers. And the two buildings will be connected with a skyway. This remarkable project not only involves all these other partner agencies and services, but it required Tim's remarkable leadership to pull it off. And this is the kind of community leadership which we want to highlight in this program with you all. He holds a JD from the University of Minnesota, a master's in public affairs from the Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, a bachelor's degree in government and economics from, guess where, St. John's University. But among many other reasons why Tim has much to say to our group this morning is that he has worked in so many different sectors of society. A nonprofit CEO, a faith-based nonprofit CEO, a city attorney, a state housing commissioner, a deputy mayor, and an attorney in private practice. So he has seen community leadership from very many different and important vantage points. And I think that's one of many gifts that he brings to us today. So welcome, Tim.
Well, thank you, Gary. Thank you, Barry. And thank you, Don, for inviting me. This is the third time I've had the opportunity to present to those that are in the program that you are in. And it's always been a special opportunity for me, not only to return to St. John's and get a sense of the spirit of this place, but also to allow me to reflect on my career, what I'm doing, what I want to do, and then to share that and have a discussion about it. And over the course of the years, people change, hopefully grow, and I've learned and gotten feedback about how I present this and present myself has a different way to it, a different approach to it. And I've kind of kept the same notes and refreshed them, and I'll be curious as to the reactions about how, I think I really first did this in 2013, just as the new Dorothy Day Place was kind of an emergent. And then 2 years ago, right in the middle of it. And now, complete from my perspective, they don't give me a hammer once the financing is done. They don't allow me to do that.
But the money's raised, which
the money's
is phenomenal.
Raised. That's exactly right. So my job is done. The money's raised, the workers are working. And so now it's what's next? What's next? And one thing that I can reflect on is in most of my career, which you've noticed is, Gary, it's kind of career attention deficit disorder. I have come into places and built things and tuned them up and did a few major initiatives and then said, what new door might open? And so I basically left. And now I'm in the position at Catholic Charities, starting my 8th year next year, and we've had some senior retirements that are forthcoming in the next year, that is a process of rebuilding and rethinking and renewal. And so for that reason, I'm particularly reflective, and so this could be of particular benefit to me. And so I'm going to go over some notes, probably for about a half hour, but as with Abbot John last night, feel free to interrupt. And I won't ask you right now to go around and introduce yourselves and tell a bit of your story, but I'm sure all of you are going to have questions and comments and dialogue. But when you first speak, tell me just a little bit about yourself. I got to know some of you kind of last night. That would be helpful. And finally, congratulations and thank you for your participation in this initiative. We live, even more than when I experienced this group 2 years ago, in a much more uncertain world that can be vertigo inspiring. How do you deal with this new environment? I think we're all struggling as persons, as organizations and community. How do we navigate this new world, which I think has shaken the foundations of much of what I've believed and based my career on, is that question, and that's very disturbing. And you have made a choice not to give up, to explore leadership, to try to make a difference. And once you kind of cross that line, you never go back. Because you discover in yourself and in great colleagues like this that you can lead, you can make a difference, big and small. And that's a choice that you make. And in my belief, it's also a special gift. So each day you have to kind of wake up, what am I going to do with this gift? How am I not going to blow it? And that's a lot of pressure. That's, Charlie Brown once said, there is no bigger burden than great potential. and now you have the potential. And how are you going to choose to use it and keep yourself together as well? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a key part of what I think a person who aspires to leadership must early on develop and nurture and grow. And it's called your Weltanschauung. And that is a German word I learned here at St. John's from a former president many years ago, Coleman Berry, the founder of NPR. And Weltanschauung is basically your worldview, how you explain the world. It is your core, who defines you. And unless you have a core, an anchor, something that defines you, you are like a reed in the wind. You can be blown anywhere. And having that Weltanschauung allows you to have some courage, allows you to say, what do I stand for, and am I willing to be fired for, and how you go about your life. And it's not something that comes right away, and it's something that must always kind of be nurtured. And so I'm going to start with my Weltanschauung and explain to you how I arrived at mine and give you some of the essential elements so that as you reflect, and I hope you do, you can define yours. Then I'm going to talk about some of the kind of leadership lessons that I've learned in the various kind of sectors and some specific examples, and some of the challenges that we confront now, and some of the things that I sent in advance reading. And I think leaders also have to be hope-inspiring, and sometimes it's a fake it till you make it type situation, not lying, but finding that hope to inspire others. And so I'd like to let you know why I am still so very hopeful, and then a broad discussion. So my Weltanschauung, and I carry 3 books with me that are with me at all times. The Bible, this is the New Testament and Psalms, a mix of Old and New Testament. The Rule of St. Benedict, again, a very short book. You can read it in an hour, that Abbot John referred to last night. And by the way, he was wonderfully refreshing. I have known abbots back to the late 70s, and the presentation and the authenticity and the vulnerability that he exposed him and his community to last night was quite amazing. Not many people who have attended this institution or even a part of the community receive the gift that you received last night. And then a copy of our founding documents in this country, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Three fundamental documents that I think define my Belton Schoen. And so from the Bible, a couple of the verses on which I rely and think about often and read and reread is Matthew 19:26, who, when it is asked of Jesus, who can be saved if you have to make it through the eye of the needle? That was what one of the apostles asked him. And Jesus responded, with man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. That optimism, with God, all things are possible. It can't be something that we as individuals rely on. Luke 12:49-53. I have come to bring fire on earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. Do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. So think about that. Jesus, the chief peacemaker from the Beatitudes. Blessed be the peacemakers, for they shall see God. But also, he took on the Pharisees. He took on the establishment. He challenged institutions, and he rocked the world by upsetting and creating a new church that upset the foundations of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That was quite interesting. And leaders, when will you have to sow division in order to bring peace? Matthew 10:16, his instructions to disciples. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. That is Jesus the politician. How do I take this pile of social disease, form something with it, and move it to a better place? That takes shrewdness. That takes understanding people where they are. I was once called by a close colleague, and it was a compliment. Tim, you're very strategic. And I said, well, thank you. My wife calls me manipulative. Two heads of the same coin. And what purpose are you heading for? And of course, Matthew 25:40. Whatever you did for the least of these, the least of mine, you did for me. How do you serve God? By serving others. And my lesson from that is trusting God's love. And that, as Archbishop Romero said, we're not ultimately in control, God is. Do not expect things to be easy. I have known so many leaders and politicians who get to a point of, quote, prominence and think that the accolades are going to come, it's going to be easy, and don't understand sometimes how the burden of responsibility of leadership and how lonely it can be at the top. So develop yourselves to be smart. And as you do that, and woven throughout the gospel, is the concept key to my tradition, Catholic social teaching, the option for the poor and vulnerable. It is the poor and vulnerable who have the first call on our hearts, on our minds, and on the resources of the community. And we forget that, we neglect that at peril of our being leaders. And what that means is you gotta have courage. And you don't have courage unless you have a core and your Belton Schoen. And to approach your lives and careers with an attitude of gratitude. I came across this not too long ago from Proust, which I don't associate him with this, but basically he said, gratitude can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, a stranger into a friend. That gratitude is really, really important. So, Belton Schoen, book number 1. Book number 2, The Rule of St. Benedict. I don't have to say much about it, but the prologue has a couple of words in it that are really important, and that said, listen to your master's precepts and incline the ear of your heart. Listen with the ear of your heart. And how you listen, how you bring in the world, how you bring in your colleagues, and wind it through the spheres of the rational mind, but also make it come from the heart, is a really important concept, both head and heart, both and the rule speaks to that. And then Father Abbot John talked last night about taking counsel, transparency, really listening. And he made a beautiful point. He said, this is not a democracy. If you are a leader, you must be transparent, you must take counsel. But leadership in an organization is collaboration. It's not democracy. And it's really important to know the difference. Then, our founding documents, which I think in many ways have inspiration from the other two documents, the concept of natural law, and they are divinely inspired. And think of our Declaration of Independence, and think about reciting it on every 4th of July. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident, coming from God. All people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, not given from people, not given from institutions, but given from God. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And governments are instituted among people to secure these rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Kind of hard to find a more powerful paragraph than that. And then the preamble to our Constitution. Think about reciting that every 4th of July. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the common good, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, ordain and establish this Constitution. Pretty good stuff. It also helps you understand the yin and yang, because it's not perfect. The stain on our Constitution, America's original sin, African Americans, slaves, 3/5 people, kind of demonstrates it's not a perfect world, but still pretty good stuff overall. A sin from which we are still recovering. And so as I think and use all of that to define my Weltanschauung, my core, it is a combination of worship and work and service. Worship and work and service. So I offer you that as you reflect on yours to what that might mean for you. And that becomes particularly relevant in my organization, Catholic Charities, as Gary mentioned, which is a large social service nonprofit serving 30,000 people a year in several different areas of service. But our critical function is staying true to our Catholic social teaching. And if you look at the world, we can't serve our way out of poverty. We can't serve our way to opportunity. We could build 100 new shelters tomorrow and just need another one unless there was attention to systems change, attention to the community and the common good. And that's really a key concept that I have learned at Catholic Charities, because we serve in any given year about 10% of those who experience poverty in our region. And so I know that we're as big as it comes, and we still have a pretty small market share, so to speak. And so that concept of leadership, of systems change, big and small. And systems change is also how you look at your own systems, how you interact with the world, what institutions, small and large, and obviously public policy and church policy. That is a really important part of it. And kind of some examples of that. So we operate on the north side of Minneapolis at Plymouth and Lyndale, a child development center right in the heart of North Minneapolis, about 4 blocks from the 4th precinct, where a year ago, 2 years ago, there was all sorts of challenges with Jamar Clark and the police shooting. And we know that we do a good job of getting those newborns, those preschoolers, ready to read for kindergarten. And they are able, they have those skills, what they really need. And we also know that if somebody goes to kindergarten ready to read, they are more likely to be able to do their reading at grade level by 3rd grade, know their math by 8th grade, graduate high school, and then all the success factors come into play, and the chances for them being in poverty are dramatically low. But what we wonder at Catholic Charities, what happens to those kids and those families after they leave our Northside Child Development Center? Into what community do they go? What is the quality of the schools? What is the crime in the community? What are the job opportunities? What is the culture? And sadly, I think, a lot of our good work and those who support it becomes sunk cost because the rest of the systems aren't supportive of their future. And that's why Catholic Charities, we don't just want to stop in that service. We want to make sure that all those other systems can be aligned to make more permanent and sustainable change. That is really tough stuff. We can talk more about North Minneapolis and intergenerational poverty at some point if that makes sense to you and want to delve more into that. And then another key part of our work in Farsuda was actually, did I pronounce your name again? Fardosa. Fardosa, yeah, Fardosa. Was the beneficiary of another service of Catholic Charities, was resettled into this country by a refugee resettlement program in the 1990s. You made that connection last year? And the welcoming environment that we try to bring to people who join our community from across the world based upon that concept that we are one human family. How are they welcomed? How do they really become able to preserve that culture but still become welcome new Americans and contribute to this community and have the community be welcoming to them? In this current environment, as you know, that is a real challenge. And it is a real sad challenge right now. And so part of our work is not only providing that service, but being a voice to the broader community that we are one human family, that we need to welcome the stranger, and that we are enriched by the diversity from across the world and with our own country. Another kind of key example. And then Gary mentioned Dorothy Day Place, which is now in the process of being completed. And that is an example of a little bit sometimes leading from behind. And so we, Catholic Charities, built this shelter and day center back in the early 80s. And as homelessness increased, we took on more obligations and demand, and all of a sudden we ran out of space. There were tent camps in downtown St. Paul in the shadow of the Capitol and the cathedral. And we had a choice to make back in 2012. Do we just kind of keep doing what we're doing and kind of just say that, you know, that the world's a tough place and we'll keep doing the best we can? Or do we step up and tell the community, this is unacceptable. This is not the mission of Catholic Charities. And we're either going to do something deserving of the people who experience homelessness and deserving of the community in which they live, or we're closing it down, and it's going to be your challenge. It's going to be your challenge. And we didn't say it that bluntly, but that was the mindset that we went out and said, community, we need your help. This is wrong. We can do better. Here's a new vision. It's going to cost us $100 million, but think of the avoided costs and think of the benefit to the community. And that is one reason that we can have hope, is that the community responded a little over 3 years with over $100 million, public and private, and it's now in service, the first part of it. Lives are being saved every day. There's all sorts of innovations, and at some point we'd welcome to give you a tour and show you about it. So that Weltanschauung and how some examples of why you have to focus on the systems that people live in, as well as serving kind of people each day. It's that both and. We're not going to let people in crisis fall through the cracks if we can stop it. But if we just manage crises and they only are able to get to the crisis the next day, we haven't done them any better. So as I reflect about the challenges today, some are the same as I would have pointed out 3 or 4 years ago, and some of them are a little bit different. And there's some recent books that I kind of commend to you that help explain to me the world as we exist today. One is by Charles Murray, Coming Apart in 2012, and it's still current today because you hear about it as sociologists and scientists and David Brooks and others write about it. Basically, he documented that beginning in the late 1960s, how bifurcated, or in some cases trifurcated, our society has come. Where basically it is the wealthy people who attend the best schools, men and women. They tend to live in the same neighborhoods. They tend to marry each other and have families and have those family values. And as the economy has restructured, you have other people who are in less well-off neighborhoods. They're not getting their college degrees. They're not marrying. They're not having kids. They have totally different lives, kind of like Hillbilly Elegy, if you've heard about that book. Totally different lives and totally different worldviews, vote differently. If you look at any of the Pew polls that measure social attitudes, they're dramatically different. And so he just noted a society coming apart. And think about that. We talked last night about your visit to Alabama and how people have such dramatically different worldviews. And how do you navigate and have a civic culture when you've come apart? I encourage you at least to read some reviews of that book. It will be kind of telling. Then in 2014, a French economist, Thomas Piketty, wrote a wonderful book basically detailing the history of wealth and inequality since the Middle Ages in all of, primarily, almost exclusively, I guess, Western society. And basically what he said is that the natural tendency of our economic systems is to create inequality. It is natural, and there's an economic formula that explains it. R is greater than G. Basically, the rate of return on capital is going to be greater than the growth in the economy. And because it is the wealthy who get the rate of return on capital, if you look at how capital and labor resources are divided, grows faster than the economy. Most of us will increase the benefits we derive from the economy by the rate of growth in the economy. It will tend toward inequality. That is the natural way, with a couple of very unusual exceptions, one of which was the result of World War II in our history. Total disruption, compounded as it came right after the recession, and all the world realignment that occurred after that. That created the great equalizer in much of the Western world, continuing to the United States. And that is, he said, an historical exception. And you know, the world I grew up in that world, 50s and 60s of great equality. And what Thomas Murray has said, and what Piketty then demonstrated, it started to grow apart again because of the natural economic forces. Now, when that happens, you also have great evidence of the seeds of social instability. And those seeds, we're seeing them, aren't we, folks? And Piketty really had some very interesting kind of policy recommendations, one of which is in the House tax plan, just a little bit of it, the seed of it. Basically, he said, in order to have more equality and to promote mobility, we've got to figure out how to tax wealth. Can't just tax income, because a lot of wealthy people don't have much income, but they have a lot of wealth, a lot of property, a lot of stocks, a lot of stuff. So we have to figure out a way to tax that. If we get into the world of political reality, let's not go too far down that road, but buried within the House tax plan is a tax on huge college endowments, basically taxing wealth. So part of the things that leaders and politicians should do is think about how to take what is probably not overall a very good idea to deprive students of student aid because of college endowments, but to say, what are they doing? They're taxing wealth. Well, there's a germ of a good idea. How else could we apply it and make it happen? So anyway, something for
What is that last book called? The name of it?
Capital. 2014, and there's blogs and websites on it, and if you go and Google Thomas Piketty, you'll get criticism. But anyway, there's a lot of good stuff there. The third one that I would offer is Why Nations Fail, by Darren A. Smuglo and James Robinson, also 2014. And what they did in their book is basically look at the history of the world and looked at those factors that made societies successful or not successful. And you might remember the person who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. I'm forgetting the author right now.
Gerard Diamond.
Yes, Jared Diamond. He wrote another book, a successor to that, and basically saying, it's natural resources. If you have a lot of natural resources in your country, you basically became a very wealthy country and be very successful. And Diamond actually now agrees with Why Nations Fail, that it's a better explanation. And they give some really great examples. So there's Nogales, Arizona, right across the border from Sonora, Mexico. And same general population, same climate, same natural resources. But you look at the north and you look at the south, huge differences in wealth, in opportunity, based upon any social metric. Sonora, Mexico is much worse off than Nogales, Arizona. You look at North and South Korea and that demilitarized zone. You take a satellite picture of North Korea, or the Koreas at night, and it's darkness above the 38th parallel. I've actually seen this. And lights and activity below the 38th parallel. Why is that? It's institutions. It's the rule of law. It is organizing a society more on inclusiveness and the rule of law than on extraction and the lack of democratic institutions, of the lack of democracy, of despotism. And they say, and you look at history, those societies are successful, may not have any natural resources. Singapore, for example, you can argue about their democratic principles, because they have the rule of law and institutions and are not extractive of their people and seek cooperation, they are going to be successful. So when you look at our current conditions in this society, based upon what Charles Murray says, based upon what Thomas Piketty says in Growing Inequality, and you look at the trend lines of where we as a nation are going, there are some real reasons for being disturbed and why we need leaders to start pointing that out and starting to do something about it. The great divide amongst wealth, 1% over the last 10 years have gained about 80% of the income and wealth growth in this country. And we experience that here, just in Minnesota, and you can see it in the economy, where homelessness now is starting to increase again in Minnesota, in part because incomes have not risen commensurately with rents and housing costs. People are being squeezed out. Now, we're not as bad as Seattle and Los Angeles and Portland, where they're now having to clean the streets with bleach so that people don't get hepatitis. Where permanent encampments are now their housing strategy, thousands of people. And people are working. They're just not getting the wages and able to afford the housing. That's a real kind of challenge. And a little bit applying Charles Murray to our own situation. Raj Chetty, a Harvard economist working with the Federal Reserve Board here in Minneapolis, basically looks at maps. And where is poverty the highest, educational outcome the lowest? You could plot it by zip code. So right now, based upon which zip code you grew up in and live in, your life outcomes can be predicted solely by zip code. 5-5, I'm forgetting the last one, in North Minneapolis. You can point to that and say, people who are living in that zip code, they're going to be in food deserts, they're not going to have access to housing, they're not going to get educational outcomes, they're most likely going to end up in jail, and eventually we'll be dealing with them and working with them at the Dorothy Day Center. And the sad part about that, it was conscious strategy. If you looked about how we organize our public policies, housing discrimination, failure to really hold our education system accountable, housing policy, workforce, by the way we set up our policies, any good researcher would have said, okay, what are the predictive results of these trends? And you would get exactly the results what we have produced. So this didn't happen by accident. This was conscious policy, debated out in the public realm, and this is what we got. Now, that means there's opportunities to kind of reverse it. There's opportunity to do something different. But it comes at some challenges in terms of how do we think about the world. Another book I recommend to you is March of Folly by Barbara Tuchman. This book kind of came from the 1980s. And basically, she looked at the Reformation, she looked at the American Revolution, and she looked at the Vietnam War. And she said basically, what these circumstances demonstrate is that you could tell, let's take the American Revolution. It was pretty much given in the public domain that if you treated America the way King George was treating America, that there was going to be some type of revolution. This was debated in British society. It was debated in American society. And it was well considered in the public debate, good evidence, that if King George continued down this course, there was going to be revolution and he was going to lose America. Because he was wooden-headed, wouldn't listen to evidence, did not pay attention to those things in the public domain, the disaster, which was predictable, and there were alternatives under consideration, happened because of wooden-headedness and hubris. Same thing in the Vietnam War, Barbara Tuchman's last example. And I would argue the same thing in the Iraq War of 2002 and 2003. There was plenty of debate about were there WMD. Plenty of debate that if you go into Iraq, we own it, and what's the solution afterward? People were saying, that's crazy, you can't do that. Well, with hubris, it was done. The consequences that were predicted to be very negative, a bunch of people going in and thinking they could transform society, throw out the Ba'athist, and the worst results came. And now we're hopefully, at the end of a 30-year war that's cost billions and cost lives of untold amounts. Wooden-headedness, another great book by Barbara Tuchman. And so what are we doing today in those things that we can see in our domain are clearly contrary to our self-interest? I would argue that the growing inequality, that coming apart, we can see where that's going to go. We know there are things that we can do that would make it different, but our wooden-headedness is preventing the type of action at the scale and the speed and intensity that can change trajectory. Climate change. I don't think I need to say any more about that. I first studied climate change in that building, right across the avenue there, the Peter Engel Science Center, back in the spring of 1980. Climate change was part of our public debate, and what have we done about it? A little bit of wooden-headedness. So attention to history and solutions are really important. Okay, I've laid out the problems for you. What about the solutions? I wish you all had a mirror. We could kind of let you look yourselves, and you are the solution. And it takes leadership. And I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership now, things that I have learned, and have you think about them. And If you're going to be leaders, I encourage you to be a student of leadership as well. Read Harvard Business Review, Stanford Social Innovation Review. There are tremendous books on leadership, and some are better than others. But reading and understanding about leadership is really important, and then you figure out what to internalize. Here is what the research says about leadership. Leaders, people they trust, people who have characteristics. If you're going to allow somebody to lead you, here's what they want people to be. Honest, competent, you got to know your stuff, forward-looking, inspiring, intelligent, and fair-minded. That's what the research says. I'm willing to follow a person who has those kind of characteristics. And so what does a leader do? A leader models. A leader recognizes that once you are in leadership, people look to you and you have to have a greater degree of self-regulation. Because people look up to you, and you have to model the way of being a leader, your personal values. You have to inspire a shared vision. What's that destination? Ours at Catholic Charities is poverty for no one, an opportunity for everyone. And we were able to call the community to $100 million Dorothy Day Place because we said, that's where we want people to be. And this is a path to get there. Then you've got to challenge the process. You have to be willing to invoke the divisions, which Jesus did with the Pharisees. Challenge the status quo. Do it carefully, as shrewd as snakes, innocent as doves, but challenge that status quo. Get things done, and that is hard work. And as Dave Brooks said, that moderation, you have to be willing to be moderate, to be fact-based, not to fly off the handle, not to shoot from the hip, to be careful, because people are counting on you. Then you have to enable others to act. Boy, you learn right away that you can't micromanage or you're toast. You have to enable others to act and give them the tools to do it and the inspiration. And then collaboration. Collaboration was once described to me as an unnatural act between non-consenting adults. And I believe it. And so how do you collaborate? How do you get everyone in on the act and still get some action is a huge challenge. How you run a monastery, how you run an organization like Catholic Charities, how you run a city. For those of you that live in, particularly in Minneapolis right now, wow, let's strap on and see what's going to happen with a new mayor, a new progressive city council, a business community. It's going to be very interesting, but this is where we have to step up as citizens. And again, that leadership and organization, running an organization is a collaboration, but not a democracy. Then you got to encourage the heart. You have to thank people. You have to not be so into yourself, and sometimes you need to protect yourself, and you did a good job of asking the abbot about that last night. You have to let people know that you see they're working hard, they're struggling, they're caring. Point out their successes, because you also have to challenge them on their failures. Let me go a little deeper on a couple, based upon the Weltanschauung. I have a concept that I call my soul-meter. Because if you aspire to leadership, and you're going to get out there mixing it up with the business, the politicians, the faith leaders, those that disagree with you, you're going to have to compromise. There's just no way around it. I challenge anybody to think of a different way to accomplish things. And you're going to have those leadership moments where you step up, or you step away, or step down. But you're going to be challenged, because you're going to have some pretty strong beliefs that in order to accomplish something, a new Dorothy Day Center, a new service center, a change in city elections, you're not going to get everything you want. And so how far are you willing to compromise? With whom are you willing to collaborate? Somebody who might have views on race and religion and politics pretty different than yours. And when are you just renting a portion of your Weltanschauung, a portion of your soul temporarily, and when are you selling a good chunk of it forever? solar meter. You're gonna have to compromise. So when you're renting a little bit in order to accomplish an objective, no, you don't feel good about it, and hey, I'm renting it, I'm being bought here. But when have you sold a good portion of it so that you are no longer who you are? It's an old movie now, Ides of March, with Ryan Gosling and George Clooney. George Clooney is a presidential candidate, and Ryan Gosling is his second, where you literally see, and I have witnessed this and read history about this, but I've witnessed this personally, of seeing people, because of their ambition to achieve that objective, to achieve that office, to get that next promotion, literally sell their souls. They become people who they are not. And for those that know them, they start losing respect, and they never quite get it back. That's when they've sold a lot of themselves permanently. And that's a really sad thing to see. So you gotta have some courage. When you're willing to live your job. I've had my life threatened. I've had furniture thrown at me. I've spoke a lot of truth to power when power was not appreciative. And that requires kind of risk-taking and the ability to kind of stand up and say that's important. Now, you always gotta, it's always easier to escalate than de-escalate. Another lesson, take this step, no reaction, then the next step, then you go to the very aggressive option. Always easier to escalate rather than de-escalate. And it's important to be really bold, but there's a difference between bold and being reckless, not really thinking things through, not taking counsel. And that's why preparation, reading case examples is really important, because ultimately what it comes down to is execution. Execution. Otherwise, it's a theory in the wind. It's a great idea. It's something that could have been done. But leaders are responsible for execution. From taking this pie, from taking this set of initiatives, from taking this organization to something vastly different. And that is the detailed part of execution that is so really important. Anybody ever read Saul Alinsky and Rules for Radicals? Some great examples of his kind of civil disobedience that speak to the time at the Rochester Orchestra. He was arguing with the city leadership, but this was their big gala at the Rochester Orchestra, and he organized the entire community for a huge bean feed before they all went to the orchestra. Great example of civil disobedience, where he once repaid a $15,000 debt to a bank, brought it all in pennies. So things like that. Cute, but also very effective in some ways. As CEO, I've reflected a lot about what a CEO's responsibility is, particularly as an organization gets larger. Vision. That vision is really important. Catholic Charities, poverty for no one, opportunity for everyone. And this is one I wouldn't have said necessarily a couple of years ago. It would have been culture, the means by which you organize yourselves, you explain yourselves. I have learned now that culture, the type of collaboration, the ethics that you develop, how people respond to situations, trumps strategy, trumps just about everything. And taking a culture from one place to another is long-term, hard work. But you do have to have a strategy. And you have to have a strategy that you can execute, that you measure and monitor. Then you need a team, and a team that works together well. And then a leader's and a CEO's job is to make sure that team has resources. So at Catholic Charities, I pay attention to those 5 things, and as leader, making sure I have a really good team that works together and getting them the resources that they need to move forward and run the job. There are all sorts of other kind of tools, things out there in the public domain. I want to stop in a moment and just kind of take questions and have discussion. But I did want you to think about some of the things that I sent you for advanced reading, kind of what moderates believe. And we are challenged in our community to have moderates. Moderates who don't just lean left based upon ideology or lean right based upon ideology, but really pay attention to facts and what will make a difference. And to have the courage to say, because it's easy to retreat to your base, right or left, and say, this is what we got to do. And we have so much evidence on the left and the right that what they promote simply ain't gonna work if they're not willing to recognize it. A couple of examples. We know, and sometimes I think we're kind of caught between this dynamic of what I would call Republican indifference and Democratic incompetence, neither of which yield kind of good results. So look at education, for example. We have had this huge educational performance gap based on race, primarily in our inner city schools, going back to the 1980s. And there have been multiple proposals, both in education and other reforms, that could have advanced a different agenda. But the right basically says, we just can't throw money at this problem. We've got bad teachers. We got to figure out how to take on the unions and get rid of them. That's the solution. And let's just have two-parent families and raise them and send them to schools. Things will be great. The left often doesn't understand the challenges of that sclerosis in our education establishment that resists reform, that doesn't always believe that all kids can learn, and protects adults rather than promotes the interests of students. Those are classic examples where the left and the right retreat to their ideological positions, and we've left a generation of kids behind as a result. Are we going to leave that next generation behind because we're retreating to our bases? That's what I really fear, and that's what I see. Some reasons for hope. Hope is all of you taking the time to be here and to educate yourselves and to challenge yourselves and educate yourself for leadership. Hope is some of the things that I see in people waking up in these challenging circumstances and saying, we've seen our democracy and the result of things, and we don't like it. All in the public domain now is saying we can't continue as we are, and the institutions are beginning to show those fissures. And so many examples at the community level of people coming together in a place like a Dorothy Day place and saying, yeah, we're going to figure out a way to make this happen. And Minnesota's civic culture still does that more than any other. We just have to avoid that smugness that says because we've always done it, we'll always be able to continue to do it. But I'm seeing the emergence of new thinking, of young people coming in, and of people kind of challenge their own ideas because they see that what has been produced simply can't kind of continue. And that inspires hope and leadership and allows us to get through some of the messy challenges that we have. So I'm going to stop talking now before you stop listening and give you the opportunity to ask questions and engage in some dialogue.
I have two questions I'd love to ask, and you can answer them as you.
Okay.
I'm Jennifer Hartman. I'm one of the rabbis at Temple Israel, and Marcy Zimmerman sits on the downtown clergy council, and they're talking a lot about the Super Bowl and
Yes.
what that's going to do for the homeless population. And so I'm wondering if you guys have been having that same conversation and what your strategy is. And then the other question, totally different, is that my experience with Catholic charities, and I'm making an assumption here, is that it's fairly white. And so I'm wondering what the reaction is from the community on the north side of having you there and working with them.
Two really good questions. So the Super Bowl, many of the organizations that serve those who experience homelessness in the downtown area are part of a group that's been working with the Super Bowl to make sure that services aren't disrupted and that type of thing. And the Super Bowl, I think, is the yin and yang. Here we are bringing very wealthy people to this huge party that our community is sponsoring, and it's probably could be viewed as kind of over the top, and could those resources be better put to long-term solutions to some of the challenges community faces? That is a perspective, and I can agree with that. On the other hand, it's also not a perfect world. And here's one of the approaches that I take and that Catholic Charities takes, is that we know that unless there is job growth, economic growth, and opportunity growth, we're not going to be able to solve poverty and provide opportunity. And in our kind of capitalistic and consumerist economy, what the Super Bowl represents are people and institutions who do a lot of job creation and a lot of creation of economic growth, and they want to have a big party. Probably not something I would promote if I were doing it on my own, but it's one of those things of recognizing what gives other parts of society kind of meaning, importance, and purpose. And I don't want to deny that or say that's part of our civic culture. It's not the one that I admire the most, but it's part of our civic culture. What I think we can do with the Super Bowl, and there is a group working on this, to basically say, we're having a great party, that's fine, but also recognize those in need in our community. And what can we use this as an opportunity to do, as well as celebrate what's going on, to be able to point out some other things. And I say that because what we experience in Minneapolis and the state of Minnesota, in comparison to any other community which I know across the country, the attention and resources that are devoted to housing and homelessness from our business sector are unparalleled in comparison to any other. So I also want to approach it with a sense of gratitude for the generosity of the same people who are promoting the Super Bowl for what they do for the broader community interests and to promote that. So it's not a perfect world in that regard. So I think as part of the community, we should enjoy that party. And we should use it as an opportunity, not to make people feel guilty, but to point out there are other things that we can do and other things that are important to make our community strong, which is solving poverty, creating opportunity, and promoting inclusiveness. So on the race issue, we are primarily a white organization. In terms of, I think of our overall staff of about 625, I think 45% are people of color, which is pretty good overall. But if you go up to management ranks, like most organizations, that percentage starts to diminish quite significantly. I think about 15% of our board of directors are people of color. We've really worked on that. Most of our staff at the north side are African American. But yeah, we're a primarily kind of white dominant culture organization. There's no doubt about that. But we've been in the north side since 1985. And many of our direct staff are actually kind of graduates of our program and are people of color. And we work really hard at taking people where they are, inclusiveness, acceptance. But I also think that if we're going to have greater impact on the north side, we have to be an organization that looks more like the people that we're serving and can relate to that. And that's another big emphasis that we're really working on at Catholic Charities. Good questions. Feel free to push back if you want to. Those are the big issues, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Tim, I'd ask you to give us two examples, if you would. One example of your successful compromise with an organization. I mean, I spent 11 years at McAllister, where I would have heard many of the same values
Right.
enunciated
Mhm.
from a very different Weltanschauung
Mhm.
than the one that you articulated. So, and I can imagine that there would have been many things that they would have agreed with. I'd love for you to give two examples. One in which you compromised and felt like you only rented your soul, or you only rented your soul of Catholic Charities, or in one of your other lives, and one in which you said, oh, I really sold myself, and that wasn't worth it.
I can speak to the former, but to the latter, you know, well, yeah, I can speak to the latter where I came close. Okay, and so let me speak to the former. So I was the state housing commissioner under the previous administration, which was a conservative Republican administration, and was invited to join that administration, even though the Governor Plenty, knew that I did not vote for him and knew I had a different approach to politics, but we respected each other. And part of the deal, when you sign up for that, is that you are part of administration and that you can't kind of publicly criticize initiatives or ideas of the administration because you're part of that team. And I really thought about that going in on a couple of major issues. But I also knew that the agency I was joining and the willingness of this governor to compromise, to listen, to work with others, and to allow me to be the agent of that, allowed me to accomplish things in housing policy that would not have otherwise been accomplished during the 8 years while he was governor. And the resources that would have been deployed to housing with his support, because he was the governor. And so I would often go to my Democratic legislative friends who would look at me with different eyes, and my other friends and colleagues, what are you doing? And I was able to point to that with the governor's support and leadership, we were able to put a $400 million plan on the table that was going to create 4,000 housing opportunities for the long-term homeless, and we did it. Record resources for affordable housing during that administration. A lot of other stuff happened, a lot of other stuff I didn't necessarily like, so I probably rented a portion of my broader soul to be a part of an administration where I'd have to, you know, sit in cabinet meetings, be at State of the State addresses, and smile when many of the things that were said were not necessarily things that I would have said, and I might have been, had my fingers crossed behind my back, because I knew and believed that by my being there, and by also recognizing you have to avoid hubris, there's good in everybody, and you have to be willing to compromise, it's a democracy, and that you should govern between elections, that you find those things that you can accomplish. So that's one example where I did a little bit of renting, and I'm proud of it. And I have great admiration and still stay in contact with Governor Plenty, and I think he would say the same thing about hiring me. I compromised a little bit, but it was okay. we got some things done. Another one, I'm going to be, particularly since there's a camera here, a little more circumspect about. I've been associated with a lot of leading politicians in this state over the last 30 years and had opportunities to have different career opportunities that would have been on a different trajectory than which I am on right now. And that would have required me, in my judgment, to sell too many portions of my soul with things that I just fundamentally disagreed with, that were kind of core. And that was hard. That was hard to give up what I potentially gave up, but I just couldn't do it. And there's a couple of circumstances like that are just kind of real gut checks. And Could I rationalize it by, once I got to that position, doing great things, similar to what I think we as a state were able to accomplish in the Plenty Administration and Housing? Maybe, but that's where you just do those gut checks and you kind of check in and you say the prayers and am I going to be crossing the line? And it helps to have friends and spouses who, what are you thinking, buddy? Things like that. And sometimes they would slap me. On occasion I would say, no, I think this is the right thing. I'd slap them back. But it's not easy in the moment. And I think it's really important to be careful and not to judge too much, or to have some empathy for things, for people in that situation. But there are some people who I think have made choices that I think they might earn God's forgiveness, but they're probably not going to get mine for a while.
So
They're
is there
better
a
than me.
way, do you have any checkoff list or tools to determine, are you temporary renting or are you permanently selling? How do you draw the line? And that is the toughest part, right? Because how do you know this is, or how do you know that's not going to take a turn, that it's going to go down a path that it's going to end up, renting does not become a permanent selling? How do you know that?
That is a really good point, because the hardest thing to predict is the future.
Right.
And once you start sliding down a path, it's hard to put the spikes on and kind of go back up. And that's why you really got to think about it. Make your lists. And that's why you had to study history, study leadership. How do things like this happen? And you can read about instances like that. And then you have to say, if that happens, am I willing to be fired? Am I willing to resign? Knowing that that could put me and my family and my future at economic peril and community disrepute. You should not go down that slide or take the first step unless you've organized your life to be able to say, I'm out of here. Or, I'm going to do that, or, but then your choice is to fire me. You have to be prepared to do that. Joe.
So I live in the Minneapolis Catholic worker community
yes, yeah.
in South Minneapolis. So this is a little bit of a niche question, but
Yeah.
so I'm a big fan of Dorothy Day,
Mm-hmm.
and I've read a lot of the stuff she's written, and then also know some people who in the Catholic worker movement who knew her.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about, I'm familiar with Catholic Charities and know a lot of great people that work there and admire the organization, but I sense this tension between what I understand as Dorothy Day's legacy and political thought and for example, the new Dorothy Day Center, $100 million Dorothy Day Center. Because my understanding of her was that she was a more or less an anarchist, didn't pay taxes. The understanding of the movement was decentralized small communities with no no thought that those communities, those houses of hospitality would end homelessness, but would be a place to foment thinking about changing our economic system. So I'm just curious how you or folks at Catholic Charities see her legacy and maybe make sense of that tension.
A really good question, because I've studied a lot of Dorothy Day as well. In fact, her granddaughter, Kate Hennessy, just wrote a great book about Dorothy Day called The World Will Be Saved by Beauty. It's the best I've read about Dorothy Day. So if you're a Dorothy Day aficionado, I strongly encourage it. I think you're spot on. I'm not sure, people like Dorothy Day evolve as well, but she was much more, as you say, more of a radical, anarchist, one-on-one, she did not, and probably wouldn't work with the corporate community like Catholic Charities does. That would not have been, at least during her lifetime and how she conducted the Catholic worker, would have been what she would have done. So there is that difference there in terms of culture and approach, and I acknowledge that, and I expect you to acknowledge that. But in the end, what was Dorothy Day about? Human dignity and And what was she about? Courage, and being able to change systems, because she was a strong kind of advocate for systems. I do think Dorothy Day probably wouldn't have worked as we're working now, at least back in those days, in the broad pipe of public-private partnerships that we are advancing at Catholic Charities. So that's just a legitimate difference. And, you know, it's kind of an example. There are different gifts, but the same spirit. And I honor, and we have to honor, the approach and legacy of Dorothy Day, but also recognize in today's world there are different ways of doing things that can accomplish equally good results, and try to stay true to yourself and the integrity. But there is a profound difference in approach, and I can't deny that.
How do you respond to that, Joe?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think I have to think about it, but
And we could talk more about it. It was very, yeah.
yeah.
Because part of our work and part of my work and part of who I am is to recognize and to appreciate that I believe in a capitalist economy. I believe in market forces, and that we need a strong business community that's producing jobs and wealth. Otherwise, we're not going to solve poverty or create opportunity. But we each equally need social equity and social inclusion and racial justice. These are both and propositions, and I think the evidence will show, and there is evidence, that those regions which pay attention to both job and economic growth and social inclusion and equity are the ones that are most successful, among which are the Twin Cities. Now, there's a lot of problems, but it's still one of the most successful regions because of that history and civic culture of paying attention to both. But I also recognize it is so important and to the value to have that diversity of our civic culture, to have Dorothy Day places, Catholic worker houses, which I spent time in as well, for what they offer and what they bring. I don't think it's the broad solution, and you may disagree. That's why we're part of the same civic community. I respect that.
Can I just ask, when you say successful regions like the Twin Cities, how are you defining success there? And for whom?
Yeah, success for everyone, shared prosperity. And so if you look at the Twin Cities in comparison to other major regions, whether it be San Francisco, Denver, I think the peer regions that the Twin Cities would look to are probably Denver, Austin, Boston, a couple of others. And look at metrics that measure both economic prosperity, that would be gross domestic product, job creation, and those measures that measure social inclusion, poverty rates, and homelessness and other things. We do very, very well. Our biggest challenge, where we are behind most regions, is in the gaps between communities of color and the majority community. That's where we fall way behind, and that's where we need to make significant progress. So,
And that's actually what struck me when you said success, was that, you know, that gap is the largest in many of those metrics in Minnesota and
Right.
Twin Cities specifically, and especially among communities of color and Native communities here.
yeah.
So, and actually this is kind of related to your question for me, that when you talk about the systems that need addressing, the systems, at least to my mind, sound like you're talking about capitalism, sound like you're talking about white supremacy and patriarchy. But then the ways that the communities and groups you're also working with, the organizations you're working with, also sound like the beneficiaries and, in some senses, the creators of those systems. So how do you navigate that part?
Just like anything, you challenge the systems to change. And you recognize where things are going well and use that as an opportunity to say, where do things need to be better, and how do you work at them? And if you look at our poverty rates, even though the gap between white and majority is large and unacceptable, and nation leading in a negative way. If you look at the absolute poverty rates, it's still better than most of those regions. So you have to accept and recognize the good and what's gone into it, as well as you challenge that. And racism and racial inequality and the racial gaps that exist in our region really is, and I think our business leaders recognize it, the biggest challenge that we have to face as a community. And it is very complicated, going back to what I said earlier, is that we have allowed this gap to exist, and it wasn't, and it's not just business and capitalism, it's also how we organize our region from a governance perspective, multiple municipalities, how we organize it from a development perspective, who develops where and who establishes those rules. That was something that was designed on a bipartisan basis, multiple sectors. So we all own it, and we all gotta own the solution.
I have a question. So my name is Pooja, and I'm from the Hindu Society of Minnesota. So my question, a little maybe different, but there is a constant pressure in our community to sustain our faith, religion. Our community, compared to others, I think here is much more newer. The very first Hindus that came from India would have been in the 1960s, I'm going to say. And Nayana's parents are actually one of them. It would have been 1960s. And then after that, there's just 3 or 4 families in the 60s, and now we're up to, in the Twin Cities, maybe, I don't know the exact number, but well over a few thousand, and it's prospering and doing great. But again, I bring it back to that the funding that we get, the donors that we have, the constant drive is always to preserve. How do we make sure the next generation continues the heritage and you know what we've done so far? So a great proportion of the Twin Cities Hindus are first generation still. I'm second generation, so is Neha. I don't think there's many third generation. They're still little children. So there's not that yet. In the reading that was given to us, there was one line that I liked that said, you know, many communities are, you know, you teach your faith to your children on Sunday mornings, let's say that is what we do, rather than teaching your neighbor how to read, a child that may be growing up in poverty. So we do things, we've started to do things with sharing and caring hands, Feed My Starving Children, raising funds for natural disasters that have taken place. But any donation that we get, and we do have a wealthy community, you know, surgeons, dentists, finance people, you know, we do. Any donation that comes in, it goes straight into improving our structures, adding more classrooms, how do we pay off our loans for the temple that we've built. So my question for you is, what advice would you have in increasing our civic responsibility going forward?
Really good question. I think the things that you are doing are moving in the right direction. And one of the things that I see, and it goes back to Charles Murray kind of coming apart, is the degree to which we all allow ourselves too much to live in our own bubbles. And as a result, we don't have a good human appreciation for the experience of others. And so by staying true to your values and maintaining your tradition, how do we consciously reach out to each other and have human experiences? That's increasingly difficult because our region, the Twin Cities region, has really difficult challenges in concentrations of poverty and concentrations of wealth. Sure. So you can go a long ways and not see your neighbors in distress and experience them and talk to them. And so one thing I would suggest is making conscious efforts to interact with communities and people and faiths that are different than your own, to experience that and learn that. And that opens up, I think, opportunities and potential for different types of collaborations and how you want to organize yourselves. And I think what the work is being done, as you described it, Feed My Starving Children, and Mary Jo, who's kind of has a history with our organization, is really good, but also then to think, what are the systems that make that charity necessary, and what could we do upstream to think about how that might be less necessary? That distinction between pursuing charity but also pursuing justice is a really kind of hard one, and I think we all have to challenge ourselves to do that.
Right, right.
Can I offer one further observation along those lines? If I'm understanding your statement correctly, one of the things the community is concerned about is raising generations in the faith.
Correct.
Yes. And how is that going to continue? And I think Gary can also speak to this quite directly. It has been shown that religious communities that are active in the civic realm will retain younger people in their communities at a greater rate than communities that just become very self-enclosed.
Right.
So it's actually a win-win situation for your community to become involved. And so if you have older people in your community who are saying, oh, we're really worried about our grandchildren, you can say, well, yeah, but becoming involved in these civic projects will actually help
Right.
our community to maintain its hope over time.
That's true. Right.
Yeah, the language, thanks Don for that, I think the language which and I distributed an article by Nancy Almerman from this book, The Civic Life of American Religion, and essentially this competition between the need of religious communities to bond, to use the language from Robert Putnam, to bond with each other, to strengthen each other, and its connection to the bridging opportunities, to bridge to other communities, is a constant struggle. And Don is right, I think that the sociological evidence certainly seems to attest to the truth of that those who have been active in their outside community are also active within the community and building up the community piece. But to be fair, your point about recent immigration and the need, this is an experience that the American Protestant community, as an example, and much of the evidence comes from those have been around for a couple hundred years and have kind of developed that. So the challenge of enabling those communities to build themselves up, to pass the faith, to know that they are secure enough so they can kind of do that.
That's a real open question about the growth of the nuns, NONES, and the report that came out just last week from Pew that talked about how most people now believe, or I think a plurality, if not a majority, is that people can be good without that goodness being kind of anchored in a faith or a faith tradition. And how do we think about that? We're all, I think, connected to faith communities. I think, my kids, much less so. Will that change over time? I don't know. And how important is it? Because there is the march, and how will traditions change? Pope Francis has brought a tremendous freshness to the Catholic Church and to the broader community, and is inspiring a lot of young people. But what does that mean for the future of all of our faith communities? And how do young people find God now? They might not find God through church or through necessarily faith. That's something really interesting to try to understand.
And they may not even, my experience is they may not even be using that language for something that might be, they might speak of transcendence or some other language as opposed to the language which religious communities have used historically.
We just did a survey of I teach in a junior high principal at Mill St. Margaret's.
Oh, you
in
are?
St.
Okay,
Louis
sure,
Park.
yeah.
And we just surveyed our students in our annual faith formation survey, and we strategically placed the questions a little bit differently to talk about how they interacted with their faith, and questions that had direct references to, you live your life to be more like Jesus, for instance, had a much lower acceptance rate for junior high students versus that element of spirituality and this idea that somehow they connect their faith with service. So I feel like we've been talking about this question with how kids are interacting with their faith. And it's interesting to see how they connect action so much more with faith versus this idea we ask them, do you see yourself belonging to a parish in 10 years? And that number's gone down each year. But then we see our numbers rise of, does service somehow enrich your faith life? And there's a large group of students that have that. So it is this idea of generational change, right? And how we are still, as a school, I think, our constant struggle is supporting their students in their faith life, in how they interact with their faith first.
Interesting. And Catholic Charities, we're a social service agency. We're connected to the Catholic Church, but we're not part of the official church and not controlled by the official church. So it's a little bit of a both-and institution as well.
Quick question for you, if somebody has an answer.
Sure.
So I was going to ask, I think as Muslims, we usually have a challenge of how to vote because there's no perfect political party. Essentially, we are a two-party system. The independents don't really win, and they haven't really won any major office. So the question is, how do you vote to balance your moral values versus the social values? I would imagine Catholics has something similar. And I think Muslims, what has been on the ground is Muslims have also, based on all the polls, they have voted overwhelmingly Democratic. But even though, if you look at some of the moral issues, they're conservative when it comes to some of the social issues, but they voted more Democratic because some of the issues. How do you justify, or how do people justify that?
I think the dynamic you just described is very much alive in the traditional kind of Catholic voter, where many Catholic voters will be more conservative on social issues, but because of our Catholic social justice, would be more liberal on some of the other issues. And it's not a perfect world. So you kind of got to decide about the practicalities of this candidate, this election, kind of which way to go. And I think both parties should be more open to legitimate diversity. I think it is sad that the party with which I have been mostly associated with my life, I grew up thinking, learning that Irish Catholic Democrat was one word, that party is sometimes very close to points of view that look at life issues and other issues a little bit more nuanced than a strict kind of pro-choice, abortion-on-demand attitude. And that's created a great fissure and driven many of the Catholic votes away. And some of those issues, there's legitimate civic discussion about that. And I think the Republicans as well could be more open and thinking about issues of social justice and poverty and how to think about, in a capitalist society, we need these workers. Henry Ford basically said, I want my workers to be able to afford my cars, otherwise I'm going to be out of business. So how do you think about those nuances? And again, to get away from the poles, that bipolar circumstance, and it requires good people to stand themselves up for office and offer alternative view to be the moderate that David Burks speaks of. But it's really hard. It's really hard, and our system perpetuates that. It fosters that divisiveness right now for all sorts of reasons. Yeah, you have a question.
Hi, my name is Neha Markanda. I'm also affiliated with the Hindu Society of Minnesota. So first I'd like to kind of create a backdrop that will lead to a two-part question for you. So there was an article that I was reading that came out recently that the United States, out of 22 most developed nations in the world, the United States came in 20 out of 22 as far as education, which was everything from reading, writing, math, STEM, everything. So as I got to thinking about that, because I've been passionate regarding education since I'm the daughter of someone who spent 47 years in academia, teaching engineering students a PhD in math. That's something that's been ingrained for me in my upbringing since I was young. So I have noticed, because of the fact that I've grown up in different parts of the world, that there seem to be some systemic issues within the education system, right? And the ecosystem, as I like to call it, whether that ecosystem is taking a look at teachers or students and the best way that a student ought to be learning, or families and the roles that families play in the education system. And as Pooja mentioned, right, from a young age, right, at least in the Indian community, you're taught to pursue fields in the science, technology, engineering, or math aspect. And so pretty much for me, those were the 4 elements that I was presented when I was young. So
You stemmed from that, right?
I stemmed from there, no pun intended. So with that, I would say my questions to you, the first one or more so being, have you seen that there is a willingness to adapt with the various constituents in the education system so that the students that come out of high school and college and ultimately go into college or go into a vocational college, that they remain competitive locally, domestically, and perhaps even internationally, right, if the thread were to go that way? And then how do we all together pool our alternative views in such a fashion for the betterment of education locally and ultimately internationally?
Wow, great question. And if I could point to one area that I've tried to work in, tried to make a difference in, and have been so frustrated because of that statistic that you just pointed to, that would be it. So the answer to your first question is, by the evidence, a resounding no. We don't get it. We haven't gotten it. We've expressed an unwillingness to get it for 30 years. When I graduated from the Humphrey School in 1983, a report was issued by the Reagan Department of Education called A Nation at Risk, pointing to basically the same facts that you just pointed to back in 1983, and said, if a foreign power had brought to this country the educational results and the educational system that we have, we would have declared it an act of war. And what have we done since 1983? Very, very little. Because we have anchored to our ideologies, one side saying, let's just go to vouchers, we need better teachers, we need better families, and just, if you're not gonna do that, I'm not gonna help. Another side saying, you know, we got all this poverty, we got all these challenges, some of these kids can't learn. And you know what? We gotta worry more about the adults than the kids in the system. And those two polar opposites, in spite of a lot of good micro examples of choice here and there and charter schools, we haven't really done nearly as well as we need to move the dial. And that is one of, I look back over my 30-some years in civic life, one of the biggest failures. And I have been a part of or seen so many leaders, particularly business leaders, really try their best, but it will be a few who will try it while others are working on something else. Then they just get burnt out. And quite frankly, they have post-traumatic stress syndrome from trying. They get clawed up and eaten by the system. Another few will try it, and then they'll get clawed up and eaten up by the system. And they have post-traumatic stress syndrome. There has not been a sustained to scale intense effort that can really address the issue. Now it's a complicated, wicked problem that is more than just education. It's housing patterns and developments. It's all sorts of things. It is that phenomenon of what zip code you live in. But if we don't get better at that, this region, this country, is really not going to be in a good place, or at least as good as it could be in the next 30 years. Just a couple of one example that I'll point to that is just that kind of makes the case. We have a program in our education system that allows people who live in areas of basically poverty, witness North Minneapolis, to send their kids via bus to schools that are better performing, schools of opportunity. And it's called the Choice is Yours program. And so here's what happens. You have African American families and parents in the north side of Minneapolis basically choosing, I don't want to send my kids to those schools. And so they send them to Eden Prairie, where it's still primarily a white school, white community, by bus. So they're up at 5:30 in the morning, taking the bus, and they go into an environment where not many people look like them. They get a darn good education, and then they come back, hard to participate in extracurricular activities, and we put people in that choice. Instead of fixing the schools where they are,
Right.
or allowing for housing opportunities to exist where the good schools are, more affordable housing, a more welcoming environment. In fact, I will send to Barry a series of articles that appeared in the Minneapolis Star Tribune by Adam Bells about a year ago, talking about the zip code factor and telling the stories of people. One woman who moved from North Minneapolis to Chanhassen because she wanted her kids to have a better opportunity to get a good education. And it was through a legal settlement way back in the 90s that allowed her to get some subsidy to live in Chanhassen. And she raised her kids there. Her kids got a great education, and they were about to, not quite out of high school. The voucher expired. She couldn't afford her place. And they were forced, in her mind, to move back to North Minneapolis. Her kids were sick. They didn't want to change schools. They didn't want to go back to an area of crime. But they were basically, by market forces, forced to. Instead of having quality schools everywhere and allowing people housing choice and making sure that it's available for various income levels. That's the region that we have developed. And that's the region, a primary reason we have those poor educational outcomes. There are lots of other things to do with STEM and community colleges and training. But that is the fundamental one that is key to our racial disparities by education. And business leaders are increasingly recognizing it because those are our workers and we need more jobs. But to get to the speed, scale, and intensity, I want to be optimistic, but I'm having trouble, and I want you to take it on, would you?
We'll all do our best.
So Neha, let me just kind of say, in some ways to build on what Tim just said. So one of the people who has committed to coming and being with us, whether it be the summer or the early fall, is Dr. Art Rolnick, who was the vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank for research and has done the extraordinary work on the achievement gap for this quite remarkable program that's actually unfolding in North Minneapolis, in the Achievement Zone in North Minneapolis, addressing the question of kind of early childhood education. And he'll be one of the people, I think, who will be able to help us begin to think about that question. And also, I'm going to have a discussion tomorrow with Michael Grover, who is the Director of Community Development at the Federal Reserve, and whether he'll join us for the third session or perhaps for this one to talk about this connection between housing and transportation and healthcare and education. Because at the end of the day, as I think we know, those are all interconnected, and if we don't have kind of the global view that people in community development and the Federal Reserve is interested in this connection between the nonprofit and the business world in a quite profound way.
Art's a good friend of mine, and we see each other regularly, and he's been a strong proponent through his research of early childhood development. But the question still is on the table, and we're a strong partner with the Northside Achievement Zone. What happens to those kids afterward?
Right.
Where are they going to live? Where are their kids going to go to school? What's going to happen in that neighborhood? And we haven't solved for that yet. Now, I agree, you don't leave any kid behind. You do the best you can. But because of the zip code and because of the dynamics, you're giving them two anchors when they need wings.
I'm Aaron Weininger. I'm a rabbi at a Daf Yisrael congregation in Minnetonka. You talked about Democratic incompetence, Republican indifference, but thinking in our state, perhaps nationally, but especially in our state, how do you see the influence of populism and kind of traditional divisions by party, in my mind, breaking down, and perhaps people voting very differently than they would otherwise, but populism being a significant influence on our state policies.
So I think what you've seen in populism, I think you saw that play out in the Minneapolis and St. Paul elections. People frustrated nationally, a little bit locally, and then saying, we just need something dramatically different. I think, 6 years ago, we saw the Tea Party populism, a populism from a different point of view. And what populism signifies to me is tumult, dissatisfaction, a cry for change. What populism doesn't necessarily signify to me is really thinking through systemically what type of solutions are going to work and how sustainable are they. So populism provides the energy, but it doesn't necessarily translate into ideas that will work and that will be sustainable. And that's the role of leadership. To understand the beauty and the power of that populism, but to really listen, to connect it to history, to connect it to facts and research, and do something with it that is really actionable and sustainable. And so when you look at populist movements throughout history, the challenge has been that next step. And then you get tumult. You get some good things happening, and you get some bad things happening. And that's the role of leadership, is to take that populism and that emotion and that power which is legitimate and which is felt and is right, and channel it and work with it. Not in a sense of arrogance. I know I'm smarter than you, I'm better than you, I've studied this stuff, therefore you gotta follow my way. But no, to really work with it, and to connect it, and collaborate with it, and make something good happen with it. That's how I would do it.
I think we could continue, but given our time constraints, I want to ask you to join me in offering our gratitude to Tim for a wonderful